Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters. Sadly, stories of horrific violence are not new in Mexico. Battles between drugs cartels have seen thousands killed in the country over the past 2 decades. In 2014, a story emerged that seemed to fit with that tragic story, a group of students that were attacked and then literally disappeared in a small southern town. As time has gone by, a story has emerged that shows a complicity that reaches the highest levels of Mexican government. With us here to talk about that story and what it says about Mexican politics, we have Ana Paula Jimenez, an academic currently writing her master's at the LSE in the UK. Hello and welcome, Ana.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. This is a complex story, and we're get into the aspects of all aspects of it in some detail, and then look at what it says about Mexican politics. I have to say we've never done a story on Mexico before, so this is a new one for most of us watching here. But just to start with, tell us a bit about yourself. You're currently doing your master's at LSE, but what did you do before?
Yeah, I'm currently doing my master's, as you mentioned, at LSE. I'm a candidate who will hopefully graduate next year. But I'm really interested in looking at the study and development of public policy in Mexico through an intersectional gender perspective. So my main focus of research is public policy and gender studies. And I previously worked in one of the biggest mobility or the biggest mobility app in Mexico in the government affair area. And also I worked as a public affairs consultant. And between some of the topics that I did my work on was federal and local regulation, tax compliance, and among other issues related to government affairs. Before that, I was trained with the Centro ProVH, which is the current organization that is working with the families of the victims in the case that we're going to talk about today in victim support. So I had a really in-depth training of the techniques and the perspectives and just everything that you need to know when supporting families of victims in Mexico.
And have you had contact with the families of the 43?
No. What I did was worked and get trained by the people who are working with them. So they're lawyers, the forensic experts, but no, I have no contact with them. And everything was, of course, like very safe for the family. So it was more like a training through the perspective of the case because it's still a very...
The people who work around it, yeah. And that other question about the relationship between the local authorities and the federal authorities is another key thing that we're going to get into. So just to start with, tell us what happened back in 2014. There's a group of students. Where did they come from and what were they doing in Iguala?
Yes. So in Mexico, we have special schools, which are called normales, in which students go to become teachers. So this was a very particular kind of normal in the state of Guerrero, which is in the coast of Mexico. It's a very rural state. It's a very poor state. And it's a state that it's sadly very much involved with criminal groups. And the criminal groups are very much everywhere in the state. So in this particular school, it was an all-male school in which they were training to become teachers. But it was very special because it was a community kind of independent school in which they were taught to grow their own food. They were living together. So kind of creating the sense of community and also as a payback to the school. So they were training to be students. And they come from very, very rural area in Iguala. Ayotzinapa in particular is like even a smaller town in the state of Guerrero. And most of these students, most of these young men were sons of farmers, sons of people who don't even speak Spanish. So they were seeing this opportunity as a way to kind of move out of this way of living and provide a better future for themselves, for their families, and just kind of move away from this reality, harsh reality in which criminal groups and cartels are very much involved in their everyday life.
So they were looking for an opportunity to better themselves, serve their community, quite a big sort of communal sense to it. And also, am I quite right in saying a sort of socialist, quite left-wing ideology surrounding that too?
Yes, exactly. And if you actually see pictures or videos of you actually go to the school, you will see kind of very socialist phrases. You will see images of El Che Guevara, so a very much socialist, communist kind of school in which these ideals were given to the students. Even they were taught to kind of go against the system, question the system. And so it was a particular different school compared to the rest of the normales in Mexico, because it was very much teaching the students to challenge the system, which of course is never something that governments like.
And what were the students doing when they were going through Iguala? What was the point of them? I think they were heading north, weren't they?
They were actually going to Mexico City. So in '68, there was a big massacre of students in Mexico City in which the government, the army killed many, many students in Mexico City. And it became kind of a fight of ideologies of let's fight against the government. So many, many years later, in 2014, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, the students were moving to Mexico City, were actually traveling to Mexico City to participate in the annual protest that happens every year in Mexico to commemorate the massacre of those students. So they were actually, as we were mentioning, very much taught to fight against the system. So they were going to Mexico City to protest against.
And it may sound like an odd thing to say, but there's a tradition of students taking over buses, public buses, in order to go to the destination. So I think part of the thing was going to Iguala because they wanted more transport. They wanted to get more buses. With more buses, you can take more people, and then you'd have a bigger demonstration.
Exactly. Because they come from a very rural area with very limited resources. It was kind of their tradition to just go to a bigger city. So from Ayotzinapa to Iguala, take the buses, and then with those buses get to Mexico City.
Okay, and then what do we know what happened then? They get to Iguala and things go badly very quickly.
Yes, so there were 5 buses that were going to Mexico City. They were going to travel throughout the night. They took different routes because some of the streets were closed, which gives a sense that the government and the local authorities were already following the students, and they had to kind of break apart, take different routes, and then an attack happens on the students, and particularly 2 buses were taken in which more than 43 students were on the buses, and local police officers came, attacked the bus, killed some of the students, and then took 43 students, put them in a car, drove away. And to this day, 9 years later, we still do not know what happened to those students.
It's incredible. I know that there was some video footage that got out that night of students saying, you know, we're students, don't shoot. We're not armed. We don't have arms. We're shoots. And also some of them saying, you know, just wait till this media coverage gets out to the media, because, you know, you can't start shooting at students. So as those video clips got out, I mean, it's not, as you pointed out to me before we did this interview, it's not clear that they were killed at that point. We don't know. We know that some of them were shot at that point, but we don't know until this very day, we don't know what happened.
Yeah, everything that happened that night and the things that happened after are still very much unclear for everyone, for the students that survived, because we have a couple of students that survived that night, a couple of students who were killed on site and their bodies were found that day or a couple of days later. And to this day, the families still don't have any answer. So all we know is in these 9 years, all we know is that these buses were approached violently by the police, the local police officers. We now know that many of those local authorities are or were involved with local drug groups. So many of those police officers and soldiers were part of this organized crime groups, and they thought that those buses were kind of moving drugs. So they wanted to take control of those buses in order to, stop the buses from going to Mexico City, and then this common dispute between organized crime. And yeah, then they took these 43 students. Cameras were turned off, so we just have some footage of where they were going. But yeah, to this day, we still don't know what happened to the students.
Okay, and I guess this is where the critical bit comes in, because really the story is not just obviously the key thing is about the 43 students who disappeared, but the story is really about how the government handled it in the years afterwards, the numerous investigations that took place, and the government and also local authorities' attempts or basically refusal to reveal the truth. And it's that process afterwards that's really the shocking bit of it. So can we just talk about what happened exactly after that first night? Who was responsible for investigating it after that first night?
So the first kind of information that we got was local authorities, which were the same people who attacked the students, so local police officers, came to the crime scene and altered the crime scene. So that's the first thing we know, that the same police officers that attacked the students were the same police officers that later that day and through the morning came alter the crime scene.
How do we know that? How do we know that? Has that come? When did that come out?
So all of the information that we know today comes from an interdisciplinary group of experts that was assigned by the Inter-American Court of Justice. And what they basically said is, we need this group of experts, foreign experts, not Mexican authority, no Mexican commission, nothing, foreign experts to come and analyze whatever pieces of information we can gather. And they are the ones who have told this story and have published all of these things that I'm mentioning to you.
Am I right in saying that they were actually brought in at a very early stage? So you have two sets of people investigating it. You've got local authorities, you've got federal authorities, but then you've got also this international commission, which includes Argentinian forensic analysts.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So it gets complicated because it became kind of a power struggle of who has the truth. Is it the Mexican authority who's investigating the case, or is it this foreign people who, should we trust them? Should we not trust them? And so it becomes an investigation on the local level. Yeah. And then when people start seeing that it also involves local police officers, the army as well, organized groups, it becomes an issue on a federal level. And then the Fiscalía General, which is the federal organization that looks into crimes and investigations, gets involved. At the same time, we bring these external experts to do the investigation, because what we were seeing in the investigation led by the government were all lies, basically. Yeah, they created a crime scene, and then throughout the years, they created this thing which is called the historic truth, in which they basically came up through corruption, through torture, through altering the crime
I
scene.
want to come to that in just a second, because that's the next thing I do want to talk about, which is they call it the historic truth. But if I do want to say, for people watching, please do put questions if you've got any questions in the Q&A box, and we can put those questions to Ana as we go along. But I also want to point out, if you're in the UK, or if you've got access to the BBC's online material, there's an excellent documentary. I think it's maybe called The 43. I can't remember the title. Maybe Karen can look up the title of this documentary while we're discussing this. But there's an excellent documentary, a 3-part documentary that takes you through everything that we're going to talk about this evening. And one of the things that really stands out from that documentary is the news coverage of the 43. This is a big news story when it breaks. The very days. It's not like this is discovered, weeks later. This is a news story the day after. And there are Mexican naval marine officers in charge of securing the scene, securing the area where supposedly the bodies of these students have been burned, and this area is cut off. And so they have their own forensic site. The local forensic teams are sent into this site that has been cordoned off by the Mexican Navy. And then there's this separate team of international investigators with the Argentinian forensics who know nothing about this, but they are filming this at the same time. So all of these things that we're going to talk about later are caught on video and film. So I do urge people, if they want to go and look at that video. So this leads to my question, Anna. What was the government initially suggesting? What was the government saying? What had happened?
So the initial suggestion, and it's important to point out that this suggestion comes in order to kind of lead the families away from the big problem, which was the army and the organized crime are together. The people who took the students were army people or police officers. So the initial kind of way in which the government tried to take that news away was saying, okay, what happened was an organized group came, took the students, killed them, burned them to ashes, and threw them in this river that is very close to where they were taken from. As you were saying, this video is very important because later on, the experts, this interdisciplinary group of experts that were in Mexico for many, many years doing research and investigating the case, found out through footage, through many, many witnesses, that a day before that video was published or presented as evidence of the government being like, hey, we found them. A day before, the government was planting, we don't know exactly what, but they were making up the crime scene. So then the next day, they show up, they're like, oh my God, we found rest of the rest of the students, they're here. Parents of the students, this is what happened. And it's amazing just to think that the army and the top people in government, people really close to the president of Mexico, people really high in the rankings of the army, kind of collaborated to create this historic truth as a way to lead the media, the world in general, away from the problem of having organized crime involved in government, and just kind of saying, okay, this is what happened, we're done, this is the case, let's close it, let's move on.
Can you talk about Thomas Zeron or Theron? I don't know how to pronounce his name in Mexican accent, but he was the initial prosecutor appointed by the government, and he managed to extract confessions that backed up the government's story, this so-called historic truth. What emerged subsequently?
Yes, so he presented the historic truth in which he said everything that I just told you. They kidnapped the students. They kidnapped the students, they killed them, they burned them, and then they threw their bodies in this river.
And the mayor of Iguala was arrested, plus his wife, and it was meant to be a conspiracy between the mayor and local organized crime.
Exactly, on a local level. I think that, as you just mentioned, that's another important factor. The federal government trying to point out that it was only a problem of the local government. The organized crime, yes, it is involved with the government, but only on a local level. So the mayor of the city and his wife, but that's it. And then when Tomás Cerón was presenting the information, he showed a video of two guys who were like, yes, we did this. This is exactly what happened, just very aligned to the historic truth. Later on, we find out that those videos were made through torture, that these people had nothing to do with the case, that they were not involved, that again, but this historic truth was actually a lie. And Tomás Cerón is currently now away. He's in Israel right now, and they're trying to press charges and trying to talk to the Israeli government to bring him back to Mexico and then prosecute him on the accounts of torture, on the accounts of homicide, because many, many people around the case were disappeared as well, were killed. Many, many of the independent researchers and journalists were also spied on. There's so much information about how they were spying, like activists in favor of this case. So many things were built in order to create this historic truth. But yeah, now Tomás Herón is in Israel, and the Mexican government is currently trying to bring him back to the country.
There are two key developments that undermine the government story, and they take place in December of 2014. And one is a DEA investigation in the United States, I'll talk about in a second. But another is an article by Proceso magazine, which publishes details showing federal authorities were monitoring the students' movement before they got to Iguala, and that information was passed on to local police shortly before the group was attacked. I mean, that shows complicity of the federal authorities in handing over information that led to their disappearance, and at the very least the murder of several people.
Yeah, as you mentioned, and I guess this is very much known, Mexico and the US have a very close collaboration in terms of investigating and prosecuting drug cartels and just criminal groups in general, because of our issues with drug use in both of the countries, the productions of drugs in Mexico and then the consumption of drugs in the US. So yes, the DEA was very much involved in the case, because 6 months before the disappearance of the students, the DEA had information about this criminal group that was in Iguala, which was also they were infiltrated, or the other way around, the police was infiltrated in the criminal group. So they were already monitoring these conversations happening with this particular group, which is called actually Guerreros Unidos. So they're a criminal group in Guerrero, in Iguala, and they were monitoring the information, and they were sharing that with federal authorities as this way of collaborating among the two governments. So there was a clear infiltration of both the army, the military, the United States in this student's life. And that's also one of the reasons why the historic truth doesn't make sense, because they were already following them. They were already, they knew what they were going to do. So the fact that the federal government had no idea about this group, this criminal group.
And I think also that the DEA, the drug enforcement agencies, evidence, they got voice taps showing that the army are aware of what's happened. They know about the killings, and they also know about the involvement of law enforcement officers in the killings. And the DEA has the evidence. Now, this is way back in 2014. We're talking almost we're talking about nine years later, and there are several investigations into it. As we've talked about, the initial investigation led by the prosecutor Tomás Zeron, it comes up with this sort of fake alibi, this fake idea that leaves out any involvement of federal authorities. How long is it? Does that become an issue? When does that version of events become challenged by the government? Become challenged by when is it accepted that that's really not the truth?
I think this is a key moment. So this happened under the presidency of Enrique Peña Nieto. So from 2014 to 2018. In 2018, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who's the current president of Mexico, comes into power. As a context, he's what he calls himself a left-wing politician. He's for the people. He's going to support the people. And one of his main campaign arguments was, we're going to find out what happened to the students. Because when the former president, Peña Nieto, put out the story, and we already have this interdisciplinary group of experts doing the research, they easily challenged that, because they couldn't find any like any kind of bones or any kind of information of the 43 students. They found out that they were actually planted on the scene. They found out that there was a big involvement of the army. And so as soon as that was challenged by the group of experts, the Andrés Manuel, the current president of Mexico, takes that and says, when I become president, I will fully support the group of experts to continue the research to finally find what happens to the students. So I think that those are the two key moments. Right before Enrique Peña Nieto leaves the presidency, this expert group challenges the notion, and then the new president says, okay, if I become president, I will finally find out what happens. And right now, he came to power with a promise, and right now he has not delivered on the promise. He actually has also faked a lot of information. There's this really interesting case going on right now in which, because they could not find any leads into what exactly happened, there's public information about, for example, the federal prosecutor being like, okay, we need someone, just arrest the previous prosecutor, not Tomás Herón, the guy on like the federal justice kind of crime area. And it's quote unquote a state order to just go prosecute him, and then again just come up with the story of, look, we got the bad guy, let's close this case. So right now it's very frustrating for the families, especially because after all these years they still have no answers. The government has lied, has covered the army, has protected the army, has protected the people involved. And yeah, the families, which are the most important people right now, are still don't get any. They still don't know what happened to their kids. So
just to go back at that, so I think a subsequent prosecutor was also indicted. And I think a prosecutor who was actually widely respected for at least some of the investigations that he had led, but he too has been indicted by this government. So there also have been arrests of some people within the army. There have been local police commander was arrested some way back. So there have been many arrests. Have there been any has a case come to court? Has there been any final prosecution?
No, the thing is that, yes, there have been 20 orders to arrest different people from the army, including the other prosecutors that we mentioned. But when they come to court, because it was a very kind of fast decision just to say, hey, we got the guys, the case cannot come through. So Murillo Karam, who's the other prosecutor, actually went to court, but he left because there was no solid case around it, just because they wanted to quickly prosecute someone.
And I think he's gone to the United States now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. So it's incredibly damning. So what's the government's position now? What's the president's position now? Is he hoping that the case is sort of going to disappear? And how has he treated the army since then?
Yes, I think the president right now is not talking to the families. At the very beginning of his presidency, he was very welcoming. He even, by presidential decree, opened a new area investigation. So you already had the federal investigation happening, an independent Mexican investigation happening, which was his order basically when he came to power, plus the interdisciplinary group that was doing the research. So at the very beginning, it seemed like he was really interested in solving the case, which is not only about finding what happened to students, but also justice, making justice for the families. And now his government is not talking to the families. The people that the interdisciplinary experts have left Mexico. They were basically kicked out of the country because all of his information that was pointing out to the army is also involved in this case and in organized crime was very much seen as negative from Andrés Manuel López Obrador and from the government. So they were basically kicked out of the country. The Undersecretary of Human Rights in Mexico recently resigned. He was the government's face on the case, and he recently resigned. So what we can say is, at the beginning, he was very open, But as soon as more information started coming out and more requests for the government to be transparent started being asked, he completely shut down. And yeah, I think what's happening now is probably it's as brutal as what the families had with Enrique Peña Nieto. So
yeah, I mean, I want to take some questions in a second now, and I'll take a question from Marty Ryan in a moment. But I must say, I find this deeply shocking that a state is complicit in the murder and disappearance of students, student teachers, or anybody. But I also have to say that we have some experience of traveling in Colombia, and this is something the state is not beyond doing terrible things to its own citizens. How would you react to that as a Mexican? Is that something that shocks you, or is that something that perhaps doesn't surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me, and on the contrary, I'm very much aware of that. Like on a personal experience, if I get stopped by a police officer, I'm scared in Mexico City. And it's Mexico City, it's a big city. I cannot even imagine what a woman must feel in Iguala, in Ayotzinapa, if they're stopped by also the police officer. So it is, yeah, it's a reality.
Why do you say that? You say that because you're afraid of what he's going to do, or you think he's got... elaborate. Why don't you trust that policeman?
And in general, Mexicans, and I'm sure if you ask any other Mexicans, they will tell you this. We don't trust authorities because we know there's a long history of corruption. There's a long history of violence. There's a long history of torture. There's a long history of disappearance as well. So even coming up to authorities and saying, this happened to me, many people don't even do that because we don't trust authorities. We don't trust institutions. And we don't trust them because they have a history of violence. They have a history of, in the case of women, sexual violence. So we know that institutions don't work, and we know that the people that work on those institutions could even harm you a little more. And yeah, I cannot.
Okay.
Yeah.
Marty, let's get your question. If you've got any more specific questions, do say as well. Marty, go ahead.
Well, it sounds like corruption is probably one of the big motivators, but I'm wondering if you can get beyond that to say, why is it? What's the benefit to the local and the federal government and the army for doing all of these criminal activities and the torture and the kidnapping and the not telling the truth? What do you think is really behind this kind of behavior?
I think the access to the state as we know it, as like the control of the Mexican state, I think is the most beneficial thing for the army not to say this is exactly what happened. Because in reality, and what the information that we have so far leads us to believe that what happened is that the army was very much involved in all of this. And pointing out to the army will, I guess, open up a bigger question of, can we trust the army? Is the army independent enough? Do they have enough power? Or do they have too much power? So in general, what I believe is that the benefit of them not being clear of what happened, keeping all the information that they have, erasing documents, kicking experts out, all of this is because this government in particular has given so much power to the army that if the investigation points out that the army is actually involved in this, the people will want to take that control away from the army. So just as an example, right now, the army is in control building airports. The army is in control of trust funds that were supposed to give, for example, students that did their studies abroad money. The army is building hospitals. The army is building highways. This president, for example, gave like the highest medal to the former Secretary of Marines of the previous presidency. There's videos of him getting very angry when they criticize the security strategy that he's implementing with the army. So I think control, pointing out that they were involved would make people in general question if it's okay to have the army so involved in the welfare state.
And I mean, Anna, also, I think there's the accusations of, there's one thing about the army not doing anything, but the other accusation is they handed over, well, the C4, which is the intelligence wing of the military, handed over the information about the students to the police. So they gave the information about the students in the first place, which led to their deaths. And then the other thing is about the movement of drugs. The army has got checkpoints throughout Guerrero, throughout that province, and particularly around Iguala. So the drugs can't go through those roads without the army or somebody within the army giving it permission. And those drugs are going all the way from Mexico, all the way through the United States, all the way to Chicago. And that's why the DEA are monitoring it. So it's complicity and involvement across the board. And I think in a way, for me, it shows you the weakness of Mexican institutions, including the army. At the same time, this is a country that's incredibly wealthy. That is, the labor market for the United States, a huge, massive production center for the US as well. So it's deeply worrying. Audrey Wolf, you've got a good question. Go ahead, Audrey.
Well, I just wondered if the Mexican press has offered any speculation on the reasons for what we seem to see, or we see, or innocent people that were killed, students. I mean, has anybody, any writers or any people like that?
Anna, a huge amount has been done, but it's a difficult job being a journalist as well in Mexico, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, that's why I'm wondering. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sadly, Mexico is one of the top countries in which journalists are killed. And many journalists surrounding and covering the story have actually left the country, have been threatened. Some journalists have even mentioned, like, when I go to my house, I put my cell phone on the fridge because I know they're listening to me, that kind of thing. So yes, there's many independent journalists writing and just documenting what's happening. But there's no real information. There's no evidence that can point out to somewhat what happened. So also, I think it's very responsible for those journalists in particular to not speculate, because what has happened throughout these 9 years is just a bunch of speculations that are based on a lie. So I think most honorable journalists are just trying to gather information of what the independent researches and investigation has pointed out, but to this day we still don't know what happened.
Yeah,
there's very limited information. So
I've got two sort of follow-up questions. One is about, has this changed people's perceptions within Mexico? Earlier we were talking, before we did this the interview here, we were talking a few days back, and we were talking about how people tended to see, look, the cartels control that province there, and they corrupt the local officials, and it's not about the federal government. But is that true? Is that something fair to say? And has that been challenged by this case?
Yes, I think it's very complex, because people who live in these very rural areas that kind of see the central government as something like far away are not really interested in who did it. It's just, I don't feel safe in my community. I know that police officers or the authorities in my community are involved within with crime, and I have to comply. No, so I think this idea that the government was involved with criminal organization and cartels was something that has been known, but it was kind of a don't tell. We just know that this is the reality. But now, being so open to the public, particularly with the president that said, I'm nothing like these other guys, I think has made it's it has challenged, particularly this presidency, because he came to power saying, I'm from the left wing, I'm nothing like the other parties who are very corrupt, and they were very corrupt, high levels of violence and all of this. And now we have a president who's doing everything that the other presidents were doing. And it's going to be interesting to see, because we have elections next year. They're going to be the biggest, or one of the most, if not the most important elections that we're going to have as a country, because we're going to choose for the first time ever a female president. And the two
female candidates, yeah.
Exactly, two main candidates. One is completely aligned to the current president. The other one comes from those old parties. So it's going to be interesting to see how they sort of set out the agenda on the strength or lack of strength of the institutions, corruption, and all of those topics.
So, Anna, this is a naive question. You're young. You've got political opinions. You've got hopes for your country. It would seem to me that these problems are so profound, so fundamental, at a very, we're talking about grassroots level within society, endemic throughout institutions, both political and apolitical. You don't expect your military to be involved in drugs trafficking and covering up drugs trafficking, and covering up these kind of crimes. Yet, I mean, that's deeply shocking. Do you have any hope of change? And how would you see that coming? I know you talk about those two candidates, but I'm just trying to get an idea of if you think this is a very small incremental process, or do you feel that there are possibilities of change?
I think there's possibilities of change. I don't think this election is going to be that, because what we see is that both of these candidates and their whole teams are just people that have been in office have been in power for so many years. You see people who were in one party changing to another party, people who are very, very much involved in the current agenda. So despite the fact that they are the first female presidents, and that should be something to celebrate, I don't think they're well suited to create this change, because so far what we've heard of them is the same narrative that we've heard for many, many years. We're going to end corruption. We're going to make the country safer. Well, the reality is that we have high levels of insecurity, high levels of poverty, high levels of the health system is not working. And I don't think that what they can bring in these next 6 years are going to be a complete turn to what we've seen. I hope it happens within my lifetime, but I don't think next elections are going to be that.
There's Colombia's president advocated the legalization of drugs in order to undermine the cartels. Is that something? Is there any debate about that within Mexico? I mean, obviously, the US has put huge amounts of money into the war on drugs, and I want to know how that has shaped politics and shaped society within Mexico.
No, we haven't even discussed that. I think that's one of the perfect examples of why I don't think change is going to happen, because for someone from the outside, it's super clear what we have to do. Like, we have to talk about how do we regulate drugs? How do we, cooperate with the US in order to rather criminalizing this cartel groups? How do we regulate them? How we make the use of drugs safer for everyone in general? We were not even discussing that. We're having, like, right now in the Senate, outside of the Senate House, there's people occupying spaces and they're smoking marijuana and they're trying to make a protest. But it's like, we're still just at the very, very early stages of talking about legalizing drugs, regulating drugs, taxation around drugs. And of course, it's not only about Mexico. There has to be a clear cooperation with the United States because of the history, of the closeness, and of their influence in the country.
Yeah. If we get some more questions, we can carry on the conversation for a bit. If we don't get more questions, we'll wrap up fairly soon. So I'm just giving people a heads up. If you've got more questions, please do put them in the Q&A box, and so we can put the questions to Ana. Ana, I want to stand back a bit and just talk about life in Mexico and the kind of thing that people are worried about. I think over 100,000 people have been killed or disappeared in the last 2-3 decades. Is that right? I mean, that's a colossal number. It's huge.
Yeah. So the recent government information, which again, it's a question of should we trust it, should we not trust it? But the recent government information says that more than 100,000 people have been forcibly disappeared. So that means that we don't know where they are. We don't know if they were killed. We don't know why they were disappeared, who disappeared them. We just know that they vanished from the earth, kind of, which is a horrific scene in Mexico. There are, as you were mentioning earlier, grassroots groups, organizations, for example, of mothers who are literally in the desert trying to find human bodies, trying to identify them.
Going out by themselves, literally trying to dig find the remains of their relatives.
Exactly, because they don't trust the institutions. They don't trust that the institutions will find their kids, and so they're just doing that. And yeah, right now is the most violent year that we've had in the history of modern Mexico. So it's not only about disappearances; it's also about femicides. It's also, we have the highest rates of femicides ever seen. Just to give you a number, they kill 10 women. 10 women are killed every day in Mexico. So that homicides are also the highest they've ever been. So right now, it's the most violent year in Mexico. And yeah, just very disheartening. And so I hope that we can change that soon.
I mean, I want, Diane Cook's got a good question coming up, so I want to take a question from Diane before we go, if we can just bring her name up and put her on the screen. So yeah, Diane, Diane, hold for 1 second, but and I want to stick with that point there about violence against women. I mean, the question is, why is this sort of violence, machismo, permissive within Mexican sort of patriarchy? Is this economic, due to more economic uncertainty? This is a subject you're studying, but I'm baffled. 10 a day.
Yeah, 10 a day, and it has, I mean, everything has to do with money in this patriarchal system and capitalism and all of that. But yeah, no, just the culture of hate and resentment against women, and also the lack of justice for that. So out of for example, another number, out of the 100 cases of femicides that we can have, 98, so that means 98% of all femicide cases will go without ever prosecuting the killer. So
it's permissive. There's no, it's
exactly.
just not taken seriously.
So the high numbers are, yes, because of the culture, yes, because of the hatred, violence, and everything, but also because men can get away with it. 98% of the chance you will get away with it. And so yeah, that's another important factor on that.
Okay. Well, we're going to come back to the students. So Diane's got a pretty fundamental question, which I think we'll try and answer. Go ahead, Diane.
I think it possibly ties into the idea that you would just get away with it. But what I do not understand is why the students were disappeared at all. I mean, was it, do you think, a mistake by a local official or somebody local, and then everybody has conspired to cover it up? Because there seems to be no reason for taking... Yeah,
we haven't really dealt with that, and we should have, Anna, because there is... I think a logic really has emerged. Whilst we don't know what's happened to them, there's a fairly clear understanding of what might have happened. So Anna, just give us an overview of that.
Yeah. So again, because of the involvement of drug cartels in the local police and the control of certain areas and movement of drugs within states, within cities, they thought, or the information has shown so far, that they thought that those buses that they were on were carrying drugs, and they were going to carry drugs across like group borders. So when they first came to attack them, they thought that they were kind of fighting against the opposite group. And that's why you have videos of students being like, we're just students, like, what are you doing? So the initial reaction was they're moving drugs across our borders, or they're kind of not complying with our previous agreement, whatever. And then they attack them. And then they just, I guess, and we don't know, I guess they kind of over attacked them. They saw that they were not really drugs and they were just students. So their easiest way out was just like, okay, let's take them away and just kind of try to pretend that nothing happened.
Get rid of all of them. Yeah, I think there's a lot of articles written about this, but you've got a dispute that is an environment in which the students had gone into, in which there'd been a dispute between two rival drugs cartels, and the students come in at the wrong moment, and they're taking the buses, and there's evidence to show that the buses themselves were used in drug smuggling and going all the way to Chicago. So when large numbers of students come in and they're taking the buses, the reaction of the local cartels, and obviously the police are involved in this too, is that this is from the competing cartel, and we've got to do something about it. And then it's an operation that goes wrong, and then everyone who's involved in any way is involved in the cover-up, from the local police to the local authorities to the military, who are also complicit too. And then this is the scandal, is that the federal authorities clearly know they've got the information themselves, but they're involved in the cover-up too. So it's a horrendous sort of coincidence, and then it's how it dealt with it, and is the story really. It's the how all levels of Mexican society, Mexican government, can be complicit in some way or other. That's a stab at it, but nobody's absolutely certain about it, because it hasn't come out in court, and there hasn't been it hasn't been properly prosecuted. So it's a good question. I think we're going to wrap it up. Anna, what are you working on at the moment? Just your master's, I know, is on gender studies, but just tell us what you're doing.
Yes, so my research right now focuses on these institutions that are supposed to give justice to victims, and how, from a public policy perspective, they're failing. And my research, what I want to try to figure out is why. Is it because they are operationalized wrong? They're not understanding the processes of is it a failure in public policy? Is it a failure in the institution itself? Is it a failure of not involving the victims and their families? So my research is basically trying to find out, why are these institutions that are supposed to help victims?
And the question for me would be, at a local level, if somebody reports a crime, is it taken seriously by both the local police and then local prosecution at a much lower level?
Yes, so that's what I want to try to figure out. Like, what happens at a local level? These institutions, why are they failing, and how are they failing? And what's the data to prove that? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I wish you the best of luck. It's a very, it's a critical area of research, and you're doing it here in London, not in Mexico. So that's interesting in itself. Anna, thank you so much indeed. It's been a really good discussion. I've really enjoyed it. It's a complex subject, and I think we've had a really good go at explaining it to everyone. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
No, thank you. And as you said, there's many information out there. I encourage everyone just to read about it. There's also documentaries on Netflix, on the BBC, that just explain how complex the case has been. And I just want to highlight that the most important thing right now is to provide the families, the mothers and the fathers of the students with some answers, and that they're still fighting for their kids. They just protested couple of months ago in Mexico City, asking for support from the government. So yeah, the core aspect of the case is just these 43 students that wanted to become teachers disappeared. We don't know what they are, and their families are still looking for them.
Yeah, horrendous. Anna, thank you very much. Thanks very much for your time.